everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Soil Health and Human Health Workshop with Allegheny Mountain Institute, partnered with Augusta Health. We are an educational nonprofit working to cultivate healthy communities through food and education. We strive to meet our mission through a three-pronged approach, which includes an 18-month tuition-free farm and food system fellowship, institutional support for schools and hospitals, and regional networking to build a food system that nourishes our body, our environment, and our economy. I'm Sarah Spinner. I'm a community fellow, and I'll be hosting today's workshop. I'd like to remind you that this workshop is being recorded and we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel so you can come back and reference it. You will not be recorded, but you are also free to turn off your video if you would like. Everyone is also currently on mute, so if you have any questions or anything, please utilize the chat box. At any time, I'll be monitoring it throughout, but we'll have time dedicated at the very end to answer as many questions as possible. And let's see. Using a dual monitor here, so I'm still learning. So here's just an overview of how the workshop's going to go. We're going to walk through the gut microbiome with Dr. Srivastava, and then I'm going to talk about soil health and regenerative agriculture. And then we're going to go through health benefits with Dr. Tennyson, and then we'll have that Q&A I talked about. So yeah, we're all going to take a second real quick to introduce ourselves. Savita, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Dr. Srivastava. I'm one of the gastroenterologists at Augusta Health in Fishersville, Virginia. Well, I first of all just wanted to thank Sarah Spinner and the Allegheny Mountain Institute for inviting me to participate tonight. And this is quite a unique workshop. I think as a gastroenterologist with a strong interest in integrative and functional medicine and also lifestyle medicine, this is just such an amazing opportunity. I think Augusta Health is really the place to be. In addition to our breathtaking mountain views, our clean air, and our fresh perspective, we actually have a farm on campus, which is amazing, and a food pharmacy for our patients with chronic disease. We have amazing opportunities for education and collaboration on gut health with Sarah and the Allegheny Mountain Institute. So we're just really proud of that experience. So really nice, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Dr. Tennyson?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Christina Tennyson. I'm an adult gastroenterologist as well. I have some expertise and training in integrative medicine as well as lifestyle medicine. And I am a city person. I'm from New York City, grew up in Queens. So this is a really exciting and unique opportunity. I find that I'm learning so much from the folks at the AMI farm at Augusta Health. And I'm really excited to learn today and also share what we know about the field of the gut microbiome and kind of what we can do to make positive lifestyle interventions. So excited to be here. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you. So before we get going with all the material, I would love to hear from all of you guys. If you want to put in the chat where you're tuning in from or what you're hoping to learn, I think that's be a great way to see everyone and see where all you guys are from. So I'd love for you guys to put that in the chat. And if you're having any problems, you can find the chat usually at the bottom. There's like where all the settings are. You can usually find the chat down there. Got someone from Wilmington, North Carolina. Give it a few more seconds to see if anyone else wants to say where they're coming from. Oh, Chicago. Oh, cool. And then someone from Pittsburgh, a hospital in Pittsburgh, where they're a nurse manager of operations and manage their hospital food pantry garden. That's awesome. That's so cool. I would love to hear more about that program. California, Michigan, Dr. Ann Gardner, Minnesota, Mooresville. Awesome. I'm so excited for you guys to all join us. Okay. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. We'll go ahead and get started with, sorry, there we go.
All right, so I am going to briefly start talking about the microbiome and gut health. So I get the exciting pleasure to introduce the newest player in the human body called the gut microbiome. So our objectives are to understand what is the gut microbiome, why it's important, how do we get it, and what can you do to improve it. The gut microbiome is really cool because it was not something that we actually learned about in medical school. Some scientists call it a new organ in the human body that we have just uncovered. It weighs 3 to 5 pounds, and we are now just learning how vital it is to human physiology and our risk for disease. Next slide, please. So the microbiome is all of the organisms that live in and in our bodies. The Human Microbiome Project, which is the largest project that studies the gut microbiome, predicts that there's over 100 trillion organisms that live in our gut alone. So that makes us part human, part bacteria, or perhaps akin to a superhuman organism that houses trillions of life forms in and on it. It is important to recognize that these microbes are not just bacteria, but are also viruses, fungi, protozoa, and even worms. There's even organisms called archaea or archaea that are ancient and were one of the first known life forms on Earth. When we look at the microbiome, we know that there's over 1,000 species of bacteria and other types of microbes that live in our gut. And just to kind of provide you with some perspective on this, so there's 10 times more microbes in the gut than there are cells in the entire human body. And there's 100 times more DNA that comes from our microbes than actually comes from our own human cells. So some scientists have made that observation that, well, the genes among all of us in the human race, among all of us on this Zoom webinar today, are about 99% the same. But our microbiomes are only about 50 to 70% the same. So perhaps the diversity in the human race actually may stem from our gut microbiome and not necessarily from our own human genes. I usually like to say that the microbiome may ultimately be a more specific identifier of you than your own DNA. And the microbiome is actually a footprint into a lifetime of habits. So it's the mix of microbes within our gut, the good, the bad, the ugly, the really ugly, that are oftentimes a marker for our eating habits and lifestyle. The enlightening thing that we've discovered in the past decade is that the microbiome is actually implicated in a vast array of diseases that may not even be associated with the gut, such as diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disease, cancer, and even obesity. Next slide, please.
Just real quick, I want to say some people said they lost sound. I'm going to try and figure out maybe why that's happening. Can you hear me now? Whoever lost sound?
I could hear through. I didn't lose sound, but
just a few people in the chat saying they've lost sound. I just wanted to double check before we kept going so they didn't get too far gone. But I think, oh, okay, sounds good. Okay, continue. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, that's great. So really, next question we have to ask ourselves is, well, what are the functions of the gut microbiome? The interesting thing is that we're unraveling very quickly just how vital the microbiome is for growth and normal development, and actually even for our own survival. I honestly could probably spend hours describing all the core functions of the gut microbiome, but I'll spare you since you weren't planning to be there that long. I'll say my top 5. The first is its importance in breaking down food compounds and synthesizing vitamins and amino acids that the human body could not do on its own without this important relationship. The reason I bring this up first is really to emphasize that we've co-evolved with our microbes and we've developed a symbiotic relationship with them where we literally depend on them to sustain our life. The second really important function of the microbiome is developing and training a very smart immune system. It's important to recognize that the majority of the immune system is actually located in the gut. And the important interaction between our gut microbes and the immune system very early in our life contributes to training a smart one that appropriately responds to pathogens and doesn't inappropriately respond to benign things like, say, food. The third is it keeps us safe from virulent pathogens. When you have a large number of good microbes, it crowds out the bad ones and it doesn't allow them to overgrow and cause illness. The fourth, modulating important crosstalk between the brain and the gut. Over the last several years, we've learned that our gut microbes are actually implicated in mood disorders like anxiety and depression, that perhaps a root cause of many psychiatric diagnoses may indeed be the gut. Finally, the fifth one is keeping our body weight in check and preventing obesity. Yes, there are microbes that favor leanness versus obesity phenotypes, and it's an area of extremely interesting conversation. Next slide, please. Are we still doing good with sound?
I saw someone said their connection seemed a little scratchy.
All right, so we'll go ahead and proceed and see how it goes. So the next question I have to ask myself is, how do we go from being a relatively sterile gut before being born to being a walking and talking petri dish by the age of 3 years old? Well, that's the story of how we get seeded or inoculated with our microbes in the gut. There's many important steps early in life, even before we're born, that help to build a strong, healthy, and resilient gut microbiome. Even 10 years ago, we thought that we were born with a sterile gut. But recent research in the past several years has proven that there is actually transplacental transfer of microbe from mom's gut to from mom's microbiome to its fetus. We don't know exactly what the mechanism for that would be, but it's an area of active research. The next major step in one's life that leads to inoculation or seeding of the gut microbiome is vaginal delivery. In the process of our babies being delivered through the vaginal canal, the babies sample a multitude of microbes in both the vaginal area and the rectal space. And this is really our first exposure to good microbes like bifidobacterium and lactobacillus. We know that the mode of delivery is actually exceedingly important for inoculation of microbes. For example, babies that are born C-section don't end up with the same array of microbes and are even found to be inoculated in some cases with hospital-acquired pathogens. Longer-term studies do show that babies that are born C-section are actually at higher risk for chronic disease, autoimmune disease, and obesity. So the next major point in an infant's life, as you can see, that contributes to microbial inoculation is how our babies are fed. Babies that are breastfed receive additional inoculation of microbes from the breast and from the breast milk itself. There's actually really interestingly other factors in the breast milk called human milk oligosaccharides. And they actually, once the microbiome is seeded, act as fertilizer for the gut microbiome and help it to grow with strength and resilience. So by the time our children are 3 years old, they have an adult-like microbiome. But in the process of shaping that microbiome, we do take lots of hits in modern times. We may be exposed to antibiotics in children that may kill off microbes very early in life when they're vital for training a strong immune system. Hyperhygiene practices by families may make it increasingly difficult for our babies to explore environments with their hands to further inoculate the microbiome. And then there's factors like urbanization that lead to these ultra sanitized environments where you get very little microbiome exposure. Factors that seem to improve our exposure to microbes include being on the farm, more exposure to dirt and soil, a larger family size, and yes, even pets. Ultimately, we continue to acquire more microbes in the gut into our adult life by helping to diversify and eating plants and being exposed to soil. Many scientists are actually speculating that the microbiome of our children has not been able to develop to its full potential. And this has led to a new spectrum of conditions that we are seeing more commonly in the pediatric population. For example, things like food and environmental allergies, autoimmune disease, and obesity. I've always found it so fascinating that my children, have been raised in environments where there's, many children that have different types of food allergies, such as tree nut or peanut allergies. And yet, remembering being, in my school age years, I remember all of us, eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches all the time, which just doesn't happen in school environments. So certainly something is going on, and our genes haven't changed over just one generation, but there's other things going on. And we think the microbiome and how it's seeded, inoculated early in life may be contributing to this. Next slide. Next slide. So how do we define a healthy gut microbiome? The bottom line answer is that we really don't know all of the answers yet. I honestly think that we're in this stage in scientific discovery right now where we're still on the Galapagos Islands like Darwin, cataloging the number and types of microbes in our gut microbiome. We're developing interesting and strong basic science and clinical studies that are helping us to discover changes in the microbiome between subjects with disease and those that are healthy controls. But we're not always able to use that data or information at this stage in science to provide more tailored care for our patients. But what we have learned from a multitude of studies in different diseases is that microbial diversity seems to be the major factor that influences our risk for chronic disease like obesity and heart disease and autoimmune disease. Next slide. So there's a new term in medicine, one that's not kicked around very often in our traditional clinical practices, but it's used pervasively in studies of the gut microbiome. What we have learned from science is that an altered gut microbiome may be the first step that triggers disease. So simply put, dysbiosis is an altered gut microbiome that leads to disease. There's a variety of lifestyle factors that Dr. Tennyson is going to talk about during her section of the presentation that ultimately lead to an altered gut microbiome, which then spirals into what we call chronic inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. And these are implicated in practically every pathophysiological mechanism for disease. Next slide. Next slide. So the Human Microbiome Project started in 2007, and since then, tens of thousands of studies have been published on the gut microbiome. This is a nice synopsis of many common diseases that are associated with an altered gut microbiome. So we know that common diseases like diabetes, obesity, fatty liver, asthma, eczema, inflammatory bowel disease, colon cancer, and even depression have some established evidence for an altered gut microbiota. Centuries ago, Hippocrates had said that all disease begins in the gut, and I think modern science, through our new knowledge about the gut microbiome, is proving that he may be right. Next slide. So microbiologists, ecologists, and even anthropologists have developed in their scientific work a concept called fixing terrain to bring back microbes. A famous infectious disease specialist at NYU named Dr. Martin Blaser has said in his work that one of the primary reasons for chronic disease in the modern world is that we've lost, the next slide, is that we've lost many important microbes that used to be harbored in the gut microbiome of our ancestors. These microbes are analogous to an extinct species, perhaps. There's a concept that we're needing to bring back these microbes from our ancestors to actually help reach more optimal health, and this is called rewilding. But in order to provide a hospitable environment for microbes that may have gone extinct, it is important to fix terrain. And this is where we connect the soil on the farm with our own internal gut garden. In modern times, our soil may look something like this image at the bottom of the screen on the left side. It is depleted, has been overmanaged, has been exposed to low quality fertilizer, has been through too many pest control products, has been on antibiotics. There's monocropping in the environment and over farming on the same land. And in order to bring back the type of plants that we see in, say, the Amazon rainforest on the right side, we clearly have to fix terrain. And the same concept is applied to our internal gut garden. We know that there are many factors, let's say diet, antibiotic exposure, lots of drugs on our medication list, hyper-hygiene practices, and lifestyle that are implicated in terrain that make it very difficult to support a strong and resilient gut microbiome. Next slide. So functional medicine and integrative medicine doctors take this concept one step further and have developed a model of care for optimizing gut health that comes right from the farm: weeding, seeding, and feeding. In clinical care, the weeding process involves getting rid of processed ingredients, bad microbes, hormones, antibiotics, and environmental toxins. And the seeding is the process of inoculating the gut with healthy, diverse microbes acquired through plants and from the soil. And finally, feeding and fertilizing involves feeding microbes with high fiber foods for nourishment, nutrient density, and healthy growth. I'm now going to turn the presentation back over to Sarah, and then Christina Tennyson is going to discuss downstream during this talk today how we can support a healthy microbiome through using lifestyle medicine and appropriate dietary changes. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Savita, and thank you for that comprehensive introduction and for perfectly setting me up for this great analogy for understanding the similarities between healthy soils and healthy guts. So here you can see this graphic here about growing your gut garden, which Savita introduced. This graphic's more like the other side. You can see it from the view of a garden. So here, if you just visualize your gut as the garden bed, the seeds as food, and compost as probiotics, and then protection as maintaining a healthy diet and lifestyle. So that's a good way to just kind of visualize it. Because soil also has its own microbiome made up of similar bacteria, fungi, and protozoa. And following this graphic, you can start to kind of form that mental image for how our body's microbiome functions similarly to that of the soil. And from there, we can begin to discuss how the soil microbiome itself promotes human gut health through diet and sustainable agricultural practices. Healthy soils are the foundation for healthy, nutrient-dense crops. And much like our guts, soil requires intuitive care and a healthy microbiome. So just what makes soil healthy? Well, the main thing is the high microbe diversity, and it actually contains a similar microbial makeup as our gut. And it has, the bacteria, the fungi, protozoa, and nematodes, which is, I don't think are naturally found in your gut, but also healthy soils have high organic matter, about 4 to 6% per like the whole bulk soil. And organic matter is basically just living or things in various states of decomposition of any organic material, such as plant residue, microbes, and viable nutrients. And adding compost or other organic amendments or fertilizers also adds to that organic matter. And you're probably wondering why the percentage is so low, that 4 to 6%. It's because there actually is a thing as having too much organic matter, because it creates excess nutrients in the soil, far too much for the plants to use, which then those nutrients can enter and even pollute our environment. So too much phosphorus, for example, is known to cause damaging algal blooms in waterways. And this nutrient excess can happen often when misusing or using non-organic fertilizers like they do in the conventional agriculture system, kind of like that picture that Savita showed where there was really barren land, where the sole purpose is just to increase crop production and not really having regard for the soil or the surrounding environment. Healthy soils also provide the proper amount of nutrients, which I pretty much just outlined why that's important. But the main nutrients at play are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And it's important to have those in the right balance, which can be maintained through soil testing, adding or building up organic matter, and rotating crops. And lastly, healthy soils also minimize the presence of pests and pathogens, as well as increasing the plant's resiliency to them. So this was just a fun little graphic too. I think this picture does a good job depicting how many microbes are really in our soil. Bacteria are probably the one that we're most, researched and most known about. There's a lot of beneficial roles of certain soil bacteria. I actually recently read that there was one specific bacteria that's found in the soil that has antidepressant properties, which Savita also mentioned has a role. But generally speaking, most of the bacteria found in the soil is beneficial. And when the soil is healthy, it helps minimize the presence of minimize the presence and the threat to pathogenic or opportunistic bacteria. So it's really just mostly those beneficial bacteria. And I could go all day about the benefits of mycorrhizal fungi, but for now, it's just important to know that they do have a crucial role in our soil ecosystem and on and off the farm. And the hyphae here, if you're not familiar with mushroom talk, it's basically just like the branching sections of the mycelium, which forms a huge interconnected web underneath the ground. It sends signals and transfers nutrients and decomposes organic matter. So it has a really good role. And a good way to picture it is the mushroom that you see above ground is only the fruiting body. There's so much more of the mushroom much underground, and it connects with other mushrooms and other plants and trees and everything. And it's really cool. If you don't know much about it, I would definitely look into it. You can go down a wormhole with it. But it is really important to have those two. And then protozoa are single-celled organisms that benefit the soil by regulating the microbiome content, suppressing disease risk, and to cycle all the nutrients. They feed on bacteria and help break down organic matter. And then through that, through metabolizing that, they generate usable forms of nutrients that the plants can take up and utilize. So sometimes the nutrients that are in the soil aren't usable yet to the plant. So to make them in a usable form, it requires these protozoa. And then there are nematodes. And if you're anything like me at forest started farming, I had no idea what nematodes were. And I'm really hoping that when you look at them under a microscope, they look how cute these little guys look. But basically, they're just microscopic, non-segmented worms, and they benefit the soil pretty much the same way that protozoa do. They provide viable nutrients, they suppress disease, but they also disperse and spread microbes around the soil. So they'll carry them on them and within them while they're metabolizing them. And then again, making the nutrients into a usable form. And they also help maintain and balance the microbe populations. So all these things work together to kind of form what is the soil microbiome. And there's a lot going on in the soil that, you can't see it with your eyes, but there's a lot going on down there. And then here is the soil rhizosphere. So we mentioned how having a diverse and large microbe population is a key component of healthy soil, but its exact role takes place mostly in this rhizosphere, which is the immediate area surrounding the roots, and it is responsible for nutrient cycling and uptake, chemical signaling, and the competition that's mentioned here is like representing its role in pathogen protection. So yeah, most of the work happens, at least the interaction with the plant really happens in that rhizosphere. There's still a lot of like microbes and things going on and insects and everything going on in the bulk soil, but that main interaction will happen right here in the rhizosphere. So now that we've discussed what healthy soils look like, we can explore ways to build up that healthy soil, which mutually benefits the soil, the greater ecosystem, and farm production. So the practice of regenerative agriculture uses growing methods which actually improve the health of the soil and the land through farming. So by practicing these farming methods, the soil actually is improving, which is amazing that there's actually hope and that there's a space where we can sustainably use the land, which benefits us, but also leaves it better than we found it. And we can just, sustainably keep getting food from the land, which I think is amazing. And here are the 5 main principles kind of depicted here of regenerative agriculture, much of which we do or try to do here at the farm at Augusta Health. So keeping the soil covered, you can do that through cover cropping or tarping, maintaining living roots, again, through cover cropping. You want to just leave the roots in the soil also maybe after harvesting them, or minimizing soil disturbance. So doing like low till or no till. And to avoid tilling and stuff, you can keep the soil less compacted by planting things with a variety of root links throughout the year. So it like kind of naturally breaks up the soil. There's a ton of different farming methods here, but we'll just highlight some of them. And then maximize diversity of your crops as opposed to monocropping, which Savita also mentioned earlier, which are just those giant cornfields. This is the best way to picture that. So by using a diversity, it again helps introduce different root links. It also takes up different nutrients if it's a different plant, so you're not just taking and sucking up the same nutrients from the soil and not replenishing it. And then here you also see introducing livestock. We don't have the capacity to do that here on this farm because we are on hospital property, and I'm sure that would pose some issues. But the basic functioning is just that the livestock will eat and move and kind of pick up the soil too, and then leave its manure behind. So that's the basic function of that. There's a lot of cool stuff with rotational grazing that is super interesting, but definitely a talk for a different time. And then other practices include, like I mentioned, that crop rotation and using compost to add organic matter, and not using any chemical fertilizers, and also practicing integrated pest management, which is basically just focuses on prevention. And creating a beneficial environment rather than like spraying or anything like that right away. If you just go ahead and, create the good environment from the beginning, you won't be hosting so many pests or diseases. And all these practices increase pathogen and pest resistance. It increases organic matter and nutrient retention, and decreases nutrient leaching and erosion. So these are just some ways that we can kind of build up those healthy soils in our farm, while also getting a lot of great healthy produce out of it that's, more nutrient dense too. The plants are going to take up all those nutrients and all the microbes out of the soil as well, and then you eat them, and those can also be added not only to help benefit your nutrition, but also to build up your gut microbiome. Those can be added to your healthy gut microbiome as well, which is super interesting. And because like I said, they're already pretty similar. There's a lot of the microbes that we'd find in our gut that are already found in the soil. And here we just have a short video, just kind of show you, oh, I don't want to start yet. Oh, it's not going to start. Okay, we're good. This is just a video for how we work with the soil using regenerative practices. And while this video is more kind of a how-to, it does kind of provide insight into some of the many ways that farms can farm that benefit the soil and farm productivity. Also, before we start the video, I want to note that it was filmed in March, so you will notice there's not that much going on in the background, but you'll also notice some key things that in the bed next to the one that he's gonna be working on, you'll see a cover crop going, and then on the beds behind him, they're also under cover, and they're under a tarp, which is not only just helps keeps the soil covered, which is one of those 5 things for regenerative agriculture, but it also solarizes the soil. It just heats it up, breaks down organic matter, and helps create an environment that will promote those soil microbiome to like really thrive. And then give me a second, might take me a second to get this.
All right, so for a quick bed prep lesson on our farm here at the MI Farm Augusta Health, 3 to 4 step process, and it can be pretty applicable to raised beds, home gardens. So what we do is come in with, well, this is a stirrup hoe. They can be found any local hardware store really. And we come in and we just kind of give it a good rake over to kill off any winter seeds, any residue from last year that's still in the ground. Then we come back through with our garden rake and clear it out. And then we want to aerate the soil by broad forking. We keep that soil structure, but also maintain that aeration too, for root growth to really happen. So, quick broad forking lesson: we just get on our bed, lift up our soil a bit, and then pull it out and step back about the length of the tines as a broad fork. So just a nice, easy, nice, gentle aeration. We're not trying to break up the soil. Like, we're not trying to get in there and just all willy-nilly like that. Just really nice, gentle broad fork. And on a home scale or a raised bed scale, you just use a simple digging fork. You know, if it's not too big of a space, obviously out here it'd be a little much, but just get in there. So after you got everything cleared and broad forked, what I recommend is adding compost. Either compost or typical like standard fertilizer mix, organic if possible. Simply spread it evenly. We're looking for about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch on our bed. Let's spread it evenly on top of your bed. And come back with your rake and incorporate either your compost or your fertilizer just into that soil, so the microbes start digesting and your soil can access, the plant roots can access it quicker. So that's how to bed prep.
Okay, so yeah, that was just a nice little way to show you guys an example of some of the methods that we use. So it's like low till, we're just kind of scratching the surface of it. We're not getting too deep into the soil. We're adding compost. Sometimes we add some other organic amendments. And so I thought that was just a good way to kind of show you some of the many ideas of what people do to organically or sustainably farm. And then with that, I think.
All right, so
Whoops. With that, I think it's time to move on to Christina's portion.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Great. So what I'm going to do is segue into how we can combine both of these. The important thing to remember with all of this is that we are living in a microbial world. So there is a day, it's called World Microbiome Day. And up on the right, this is a reminder that this involves animals, humans, plants, the food we eat, and the environment. And we're talking again, to mention this, about bacteria, archaea, algae, fungi, viruses. So there are many different microbes within us, on us, around us. Next slide, please, Sarah. And there are benefits. So in general, when we talk about all these different systems, humans, the soil, the more diverse the microbiota, so the more organisms we have and different types of organisms, we have improved outcomes. So when we look at health, this may relate to changes in obesity, inflammation, chronic inflammatory diseases, things like allergy, and autoimmune diseases, as we mentioned. Next slide, please. So what we can learn so far is that dietary diversity really helps us create microbiome diversity. And there's a great project, it's called the American Gut Project. And it's a crowd-funded research project looking at the microbiome of citizens that support scientific research. And this is done through the University of San Diego. And basically, the people with the most diverse gut microbiomes eat 30 or more different plant species per week. So when we're talking about this, it's not that you have to be vegetarian, you have to be vegan. There really is the emphasis on eating more plants. So it's kind of a positive way to make a health change in your life or in your family's life, not necessarily focusing on taking things away, but adding things in. And these can be all different types of fruits, vegetables, herbs, any type of living plants. The sad part is that so much of what we do eat really revolves around 3 species of plants. So 60% of the plant-based calories in a typical Western diet come from wheat, corn, and rice. So there's different reasons for that, and maybe we can go into that in the Q&A later. But our diets are, especially in the modern world, are becoming less diverse. Next slide, please. So in fact, it looks that about 80% of Americans fail to eat the recommended amounts of fruits and vegetables. And it's interesting because when there's been a poll, NPR conducted a poll, 75% of Americans thought they were eating healthy. So we have kind of a disconnect of what we're doing in our modern lives, but what we're actually doing in real life. We think we're doing better than we are. Next slide, please. And we know that different factors are associated with the microbiome, creating a more diverse and abundant microbiome. And some of these, if we're adults, they're already out of our control. But in childhood, these echo what was mentioned earlier in the talk, but just to stress it again, how we were delivered, whether it was a vaginal or cesarean section, whether we were breastfed, whether we had a pet at home, whether we were active in nature, being around dirt and different organisms, and then also being exposed to different foods early in life. And then there are factors in our adult life that we can manipulate and modify. So some of these include exercise, eating diets that are high in plant-based foods and fiber, and getting enough sleep. Next slide, please. And there are factors both in our childhood and adult life that are negatively associated with microbial diversity and abundance in our gut microbiome. So in childhood, these could be several courses of antibiotics, a diet that's high in processed foods, anti-germ, anti-sanitizer type products. And then in adulthood, eating a diet that is low in fiber, smoking, being around different chemicals and cleaning products. Again, different types of medications can affect our microbiome. And then also artificial sweeteners can also negatively affect our microbiome. Next slide, please. So it comes to this question, what can we do? Next slide, please. So what I wanted to introduce is something called lifestyle medicine. And this is something that is a positive thing that we can do for our patients, for ourselves as a society. And basically, these are just general principles that involve healthy eating, including a whole food plant-based diet, increasing physical activity, managing stress, having sleep, and avoiding risky substances are primarily the ways that we can help modulate our microbiome. And these are things that, to be honest, most physicians, we don't learn this in our training. A lot of times we're focused on disease as well as different types of pharmacology type approaches and medications, but these are really lifestyle medications that can prevent and even reverse some diseases and positively affect our microbiome. Next slide, please. So this is not anything new or revolutionary. And we can even go back to Hippocrates, who said, "Let food be thy medicine." So how can we grow our gut garden? So one thing is we can start early. So if we are parents, we can start early with our kids, and we can just start wherever we are in our lives right now. And I just wanted to mention that if you did have a child by C-section, that is perfectly normal and necessary and medically needed in certain instances. So I've had my children from cesarean section. I just don't want to have anyone associate any guilt with that. The next thing that we could do is really eat the highest fiber diet that you can consume. So fiber is food for our microbiome, and they really need fiber. When we don't eat enough fiber, we're not feeding them. The important thing is you can eat a variety of plants that include high fiber sources, and there are things such as prebiotics that really help feed the microbiome. So you'll hear that term prebiotic, and that is really a fiber food that has a beneficial effect on the gut microbiome. And there's also things that you can do when you do cook your food. So you can actually increase the resistant starch, which provides more food or more starch to your microbiome by doing things like cooking. If you make potatoes or rice, you can cook them and then refrigerate them. And then also eating things such as fermented foods. And we are going to have a presentation coming up soon on fermented foods. And then to stress again, these other things such as interacting with animals, not smoking, getting outside. Another thing that's very important is avoiding unnecessary antibiotics, and then doing things such as exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, trying to meet 150 minutes per week is kind of a minimum guideline that we should use, and sleep about 7 to 9 hours per night. So when we talk about fiber, fiber is really the carbohydrate portion that's in plants, and humans in general, we lack enzymes to digest it. So this fiber arrives intact in our colon, and then it has health benefits as the bacteria in our guts are able to metabolize it. Next slide, please. So one of the key functions of the gut microbiome is to make things called short chain fatty acids. So when the carbohydrates are fermented by the microbes in our gut, they actually make these short chain fatty acids, and they provide nutrition for our colonic cells. So in a way, these are involved with functioning of our immune system, regulation, and signaling. Next slide, please. So what foods contain fiber? So the important thing that all of these foods have in common is that they're plant foods. So plant foods contain fiber, and it's found in fruits and vegetables. It's found in whole grains. There are many different types of whole grains. I have a picture of wheat here. Legumes, and then nuts and seeds are also another fantastic source of fiber. And there are lots of different types of fiber. You'll hear people talk about soluble fiber that kind of blends into a gel-like consistency, and then insoluble fiber that remains as kind of tough shape as it travels through the GI tract. Next slide, please. So the important things to think about are to feed your gut garden, as we talk about, Include as many whole plant foods in your diet as possible. For most women, a good guideline for fiber is about 25 grams of fiber a day. And for men, it's about 38 grams of fiber per day. And the majority of Americans eat much less than that. They eat about half or less than half what they're supposed to be eating. So focus on the food. Don't focus on supplements, especially probiotics. I think a lot of people get interested in probiotics and supplements. And the important thing to remember is think food first. So avoid unnecessary antibiotics, and then spend time in nature and being outside. Exercise, and it's hard for many of us, but prioritizing sleep also has an effect. And it's really interesting that the microbiome, the research is really just starting. It's kind of in its infancy, but it, years down the road, this may be an approach that we can use for personalized medicine, where we can help guide, evaluate someone's microbiome, try to make more guided recommendations. For now, most of the research includes focusing on diversity, increasing the amount of fiber in your diet. And we have to think of the microbiome that lives within us as kind of a factory that's kind of making these important compounds that basically help us function in our lives. Next slide, please. And the important thing that we wanted to stress during this talk is really supporting local farms and farmers who do it right. So we as consumers have the power to support these food systems and to support local agriculture, and we're all connected. So again, we live in this microbial soup, and we're part of it. So thanks again, and I want to pass it off to Sarah.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, I just wanted to hone in on that. Actually, was with our take-home message is that healthy soils equal healthy plants, and those equal healthy humans. Local food systems and sustainable or regenerative agriculture have a great potential to not only benefit our individual health, but build community and promote environmental integrity. We work within a greater system, kind of what Christina was just saying, and sure, we can always look deeper into the specifics, but nothing exists in isolation. And we can take that systems thinking into creating something that is mutually beneficial for ourselves, our communities, and our environment. And that's where supporting local sustainable farmers and local food systems comes into play. I encourage everyone to get to know your soils, plant a garden, shop local, support your farmers, try something new. There's so many new veggies out there that I didn't know about. Once I started farming, I learned so many new things. I never knew about kohlrabi. Now I do, and it's great. And farmers markets are also a great way to find a community which fosters this environment and gives you a great opportunity, again, try new produce and learn from others. And I know we're headed into winter, and depending on where you're located, seasonal produce will be different, but here in Central Virginia and in many other places, you can still grow in the winter, especially if you have the means to do that with certain like coverage and things, depending on if you have like high tunnels and things like that. But there's still plenty of local produce and stuff that you can still get in the winter. So it's still a good time to start. And it's also a good time to start crafting plans for the new year, whether it be diet and lifestyle improvement or planting a garden, or ideally both. Those are all great things. So yeah, the take-home message definitely all comes back to that whole healthy soils, healthy plants, healthy humans. And then change the slide. We have our Q&A, and these are just some fun pictures of us. When we say support your local farmers here, this means us. So here's a few pictures of our team doing our thing on the farm. So if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat for any of us, all of us, and we will do our best to try and answer them.
Sarah, can I ask you a question? How do people find farmers that are regenerative farming, doing regenerative farming? Because there's not any certification currently, is that my understanding, but it's in the works. So how do you find these folks that are doing regenerative agriculture?
Again, I would just say go to local farmers markets and talk to people. And that actually brings up a good point with kind of like the organic certification. We are not organic certified, and that's because you need money for it. You need all these documentations and it's a lot of work. So just because someone isn't organic doesn't mean they're not doing the right thing. So that's where these other kind of terms come in, even though people use them interchangeably, like regenerative agriculture and sustainable farming or things like that. And I think the biggest difference between all those and regenerative agriculture is that introduction of livestock as like that next tier. But definitely, I would say, I'm sure you could give it a Google. Also, I feel like it's always an answer now. But definitely going to farmers markets and just asking, just talking to farmers, and they'll tell you. They love to talk about their farm.
That's Ebony Thomas made 2 comments in the chat, also along the same lines of what you were saying as well, trying farmers markets and then talking to the people who grow the food. So we have another question from Susan Boscher. Would you recommend not washing or overwashing veggies from organic farms?
Yeah, I think most places also do like a preliminary wash just to get, the excess dirt off, because you're not trying to eat a ton of dirt. But I think that's personal preference. I definitely just eat things right out of the garden without washing them. So it's perfectly fine to do that.
There's another question, Savita, if you and I want to tackle this. It says, what autoimmune diseases seem to be most affected by unhealthy biomes?
So I would say that we have probably a research on a lot of the major autoimmune diseases, including rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. Certainly, I think one of the pinnacle things that we're learning about the gut microbiome, as we talked about, is that early in life, it's training that smart immune system. So that microbial immune interaction that occurs when we're very young trains that immune system. And so we do see more autoimmune diseases within both the gut and outside of the gut. So we're seeing altered gut microbiome in GI diseases like Crohn's disease, for example. I think one of the pinnacle things that we've learned over this past decade is that there certainly is an altered gut microbiota in our patients with Crohn's disease, for example. But then there's a wide variety of other autoimmune diseases that have seen some kind of what we call an aberrant microbiome, or a change in the function of the microbiome. I think we're still, like we talked about, in the infancy of learning about it. I think once you kind of catalog some of the changes that you're seeing, the next thing you want to try to figure out is, well, what does that mean? Is there, a potential protein that's not being produced? Is there something that's being attenuated? You want to look at the whole environment to understand, well, it's not just microbes that are hanging out there. They're actually doing active things, creating biopeptides, creating other immune interactions. And so I think we're now looking at mechanisms to help understand that sort of autoimmune response. But we do have a lot of literature on a lot of different autoimmune diseases, but certainly Crohn's is our autoimmune disease in the GI system. And we know that, a very, very drastic change in the gut microbiome has been seen, where you've got these different classes of microbes called, Firmicutes. There's all of these different classes, and you're seeing a total shift in the classes, with one class that's starting to overdominate another. But again, how we use that in clinical practice is very, we're still learning about the mechanisms of what these microbes are doing to us. And so it's not going to be in the therapeutic realm quite yet, where a gastroenterologist can use that information. But certainly a lot of the healthy lifestyle choices that we're making, that Christina did a great job in a very sophisticated manner bringing to light, are still a lot of the recommendations that we make, for example, to our Crohn's patients.
I think the next question might also be good for you guys to answer.
So Libby asked, is there a way to know yet if what we are doing via foods, exercise, etc., what may be enough for a healthy microbiome? A test, a standard, any kind of clue that you may not be doing enough? So that's a great question, Libby. And I think, all of these changes that you can make are kind of additive. So I think it can be overwhelming if we think of all of these different aspects of things to do. But in general, putting, more plants into your diet, and, you'll hear people say, and I think this is so true, progress, not perfection, right? Just trying a few of these different things, maybe incorporating a few more plants into your food, trying a new food, every time you go to the farmer's market, just picking up something different. Exercise, just kind of gradually working up, whether it's starting 10 minutes a day of walking and kind of building it up. I would be hesitant to a lot of the tests that are out there that are being marketed, because we don't really know yet, what is a good microbiome? What is not? It just seems that at the end of the day, a diverse microbiome is a healthy microbiome. I would encourage you to take a look at the American Gut Project. That was, it's run through the Knight Lab at University of San Diego. And if you want for a certain amount, you can submit your stool and then they'll give you a reading of what's the diversity of your stool. They actually, with COVID, had kind of redirected all of their resources for COVID, and they put a hold on that, but hopefully that'll be back in the next year or, a couple of months. We'll see. Anything else to add, Savita or Sarah?
Yeah, so I was going to say there are a variety of different lab companies that are offering direct to consumer testing of the gut microbiome. But keep in mind, like I mentioned during my presentation, we've got, over 1,000 species of microbes that are being cataloged, in the gut microbiome. And at this stage in our infancy of understanding it, we don't know everything that's in it. So, when you do a lot of these microbiome tests, they'll give you an array of microbes, some information on them. And oftentimes when you look at the recommendations that they provide to you, they're actionable. They may be the things that, Dr. Tennyson's going to recommend to you anyways in a lifestyle medicine approach. So I often find it to be anticlimactic. I've used some of the microbiome testing in the context of clinical trials that I've done with patients and in my GI practice. But like I said, I am not confident enough to recommend these tests where a patient is going to pay out of pocket a substantial amount of money to find out that perhaps they should just eat more broccoli. So I think that we have a lot to learn about these tests, but they're not robust enough and they don't have enough clinical data to support their use that a traditional gastroenterologist would recommend it. So we're just looking at direct consumer testing, but not enough clinical data to support it being used in mainstream practice.
One other important point, I think, too, for us as gastroenterologists is that, some of these tests are testing the stool. There's also other testing that occurs during endoscopy when we're actually inside the colon and we're taking biopsies. And there may be different information that we can glean through that. So there may be a biofilm kind of in the colon, and that may be different from what we're seeing in the stool. So I think so much of this is in its infancy. If you're more interested, a book for reading, I think that's really helpful, is the Sonnenbergs, which are a husband and wife couple from Stanford, and it's called The Good Gut. And I think it's a great overview of kind of where the science is. Okay, we have a question from Pat. How do you see the future of the microbiome health playing out in today's medical system? Sarah, what do you want to say? Do you want to give a?
It's more of y'all's question, I think, but I mean, I hope it has a large role because that's where we see a huge integration with the farm and with diet and lifestyle, which are also great preventative measures for any disease. So,
yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think people are interested in it. I think we're just finally learning how all this is so interconnected with what you all doing on the farm and health outcomes. And we see the obesity epidemic, we see COVID. It seems that people who are actually eating a diet higher in plant-based foods have less severe COVID. There was a recent study that came out that it was actually even more pronounced in people that were from socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. So there seemed to be a protective effect for those folks to eat more plant-based foods in their diet. And we're just kind of learning about this. So I think there are going to be more studies in the future, and it may give us a more personalized approach where we can look at someone's diet, look at their microbes, and then kind of get some more information.
I think there's a lot of potential in the microbiome playing a role in developing more personalized medicine in the future. But at this stage, like we said, we're cataloging microbes. So I think the next stage in our sort of scientific discovery is going to be, well, we know what microbes are hanging out in the gut microbiome. Well, what are they actually doing? So as we're unraveling sort of the mechanistic information behind what a lot of these good and bad gut microbes are doing, we will have potential, mechanisms to potentially act on and be able to tailor things like probiotics in the future. But a common question I get related to this is, are we able to use data from like a lab test, for example, to determine whether a certain probiotic should be recommended? And we certainly don't have that type of sophistication yet. But I think, as science is unraveling at a very fast rate, we're going to have a lot of interesting information to play with that's potentially going to provide new directions for things like autoimmune disease, obesity, and even cancer research as well.
Sarah, can I ask another question? For us, we look at these hunter-gatherer tribes in Africa. The Hasda is one of them. They eat about 100 to 150 grams of fiber a day, compared to an American that may eat 15. And it's interesting that we see that they have a more diverse microbiome than we do. They're obviously eating a lot more fiber, and there may be some seasonal variation. Can you talk about soil in this country? Are we losing diversity in our soil? Is there any literature out there on that?
Unfortunately, there's not a ton of research out there, at least not that I was able to obtain. There's a lot of, journals that I can't get as a common person, but definitely there is documentation that just like our gut microbiome dwindling, the diversity is also falling in the soil, which is kind of obvious as well. I mean, like we've been talking about, the increase of monocropping and our conventional food system is depleting the soil of its nutrients and its microbial content. So it definitely is declining. It's going to continue to decline if, we just continue to rely on the conventional food system and conventional agriculture.
So the next question that popped up, how do we reconcile COVID prevention advice to wash hands more with the benefit you're describing of not over sanitizing? Should we use regular soap instead of hand sanitizer and antibacterial soap? Anyone want to take that one on?
I think about this, and I don't know the answer. I think that we'll have to kind of see how this all plays out. Everything is a risk and benefit. I think the risk of COVID is very high, particularly in communities, and we're all using hand sanitizer, especially for us in the hospital. We're using it nonstop. So, I think there is a potential trade-off, but I think it's all risk and benefit. So I'm using hand sanitizer.
I think we're all using copious amounts of hand sanitizer within the healthcare setting at this point. This question got asked last year during the fermentation workshop too, which we did right around the time that COVID had first started. So I think we were trying to reconcile a lot of these same questions last year as well. And what I'd like to emphasize is that, remember, we're in a pandemic. We're like in a historically different part of kind of thinking about how we deal with healthcare issues. So it's an exceptional time, in the future of medicine. This is not going to be here forever. But certainly what we have to look at is the long term. We want to use the hand sanitizer for now. We want to make sure that we're keeping sanitary environments. But ultimately, when we provide like a more long-term perspective, we do want to remember that clean eating and being a little dirty might be okay.
Definitely. And I think it's important too to focus too in the discussion is that people who live in urban environments, depending on the neighborhood where they live in, they may not have access to green space. They may not have access to be around soil. They may not have animals. It all depends. I feel like I moved to this area from, downtown Brooklyn, which is a concrete jungle, and my kids played at a park that had AstroTurf instead of grass. So it's, definitely they weren't exposed, and they, our family had MRSA infections, from probably this artificial turf. So, it's all variable.
I think we kind of touched on all the questions that have been put in. It also brings us close to time. So I just want to thank everyone again for joining us. And we did